Hello, my name is Jo from Strawberry Attic, and today I am making a Beetlejuice themed coat. The coat pattern that I'm using, I actually made two coats from last year. The first was a full-length coat with fur trim and lace-up back, and then I made a jack-o'-lantern Halloween coat in a shorter knee-length size. Getting the original pattern piecing, I realised I wanted it to have that beautiful Tim Burton-esque black and white striped, and I couldn't actually find any fleece that had black and white stripes, so I had to figure this out on my own. Starting off, I got my original pattern piece. I ended up being incredibly lazy with my measurements. I just went on the ready-made lines on the ruler of how wide my stripes were going to be, but I started dividing up the sleeve pattern here of the coat, and I did this for all pieces of the sleeve and bodice, and then divided the skirt pieces into the amount of portions that the bodice ended up with. You'll see that in a bit later on. So taking the original pattern, now I have segmented it up into different size pieces. I'm going to start off by drawing round the original cuff of the jacket. The beauty with the coat that I'm making is it's made out of fleece. It actually contains just under 6 meters of fleece, so it's a bit of a beast of a coat, but it's really simple to sew with. You don't have to worry about serging the edges. It's a really nice fabric to start sewing with if you're new to sewing. So drawing around the cuff of the sleeve up to that first line where I have segmented off the stripe, I'm going to just measure across outside of the pattern so I know where my lines need to join up. And then on this new pattern piece, I'm going to draw a line. So this is going to be the first stripe of the sleeve at the cuff. Now, because it is going to be seamed together with white, black, I'm going to add a centimetre of seam allowance to the cuff piece, and then I need to add another centimetre of seam allowance to the next piece in the line. So lining that pattern piece back up again where the segment starts. Get the pattern straight. So marking once again that next segment of the pattern, I just very quickly draw in the shape of the actual pattern piece. And then again I'm going to add that seam allowance. So it's a centimetre for the seam of one colour and then a centimetre for the seam of the second colour. So each increment I am adding 2 centimetres. As I say, I do this for all the sleeve pieces and all the bodice pieces, and then I worked out that the bodice had 4 pieces in the back, and I think I did 5 pieces in the front, but I think I actually needed 4 to each front piece of the pattern. So I then worked out with a circle skirt what the waist measurement would be, and then I divided a circle skirt into 18 pieces. So yeah, there's an awful lot of fabric coming up. So I did the dividing of the pattern with all of the pieces of the sleeves and the bodice, and then when it came to the skirt of the coat, in the last 2 jackets I've made the bodice and the skirt as separate pieces, but this time I didn't want to have that extra seam in there. So what I did with my bodice piece is go away, we're not on your bed. So I've actually cut both the sleeves out using the whole pattern piece without dividing it, just because it was going to be much quicker, and then I didn't want to also start worrying about getting the right side of the fleece. Fleece has a slightly fuzzier side and a slightly more almost beaded side, and it's quite noticeable once you start sewing the wrong sides together, so I thought it'd be easier just to cut the sleeves out as one complete piece in black, one complete piece in white, and then cut them from there. suddenly realised once I'd done all these pattern pieces that I hadn't actually added any extra seam allowance, and I couldn't remember with the sleeves whether there was seam allowance already added. This is why I've left the fabric a little bit longer. I probably didn't need it, but I do like a big baggy sleeve that I can hide my hand under, so it wasn't the worst thing that I could have done. So once I'd cut out all the pieces, that was 11 pieces per sleeve, and then for the actual bodice, or for the actual main body of the coat, that was another 18 pieces of fabric, not including the collar. It was now a job to start pinning them all together. Luckily I did number my pattern pieces to make sure I got them in the right order, and you can see here I'm worrying about that fleece, whether I've got the right sides together to give it some continuity. But yes, it was lots and lots of pinning to make the fabric into one usable pattern piece for each of the sleeves and then the body. And the final bit of the sleeve head being pinned on here. So over to the sewing machine. As I say, I've added 1 centimetre of seam allowance into each pattern piece. So the seam allowance on the coat was aimed at being 1 centimetre. I did go off occasionally, so it ended up being a little bit bigger. I think in hindsight what I should probably do is, once I've sewn all the pieces of fabric together, go back to the original pattern piece and just make sure it's still the right size, because I did end up with the sleeves being a little bit too long, and also an extra piece in each side of the body at the front that I probably didn't need. But it was an awful lot of fabric to be moving through the sewing machine. And here just making sure I'm tidying up all the edges and getting them nice and crisp. Ideally one day I will get a serger that's actually going to trim the edge of the fabric to keep it nice and tidy on the inside, but for now I have my wibbly wobbly seams inside, but that suits me absolutely fine. And now it's my arch nemesis pockets, but this time I think I did it right the first time. Aren't you impressed with me? I was. So I'm just going to I've got 2 pieces of white fabric for each pocket, and I am just putting them so the pockets are on the right, tucked into the right side of the fabric, and then I'm pinning here the wrong side. So making sure, where my natural waist sits, I'm making sure I get the pockets both the same height down, so I don't end up with one arm up and one arm down by my knees trying to get into my pockets. And then I just pin that fabric on. Both of the pocket pieces on either side of the jacket, so for the front piece and the back piece, the pocket piece is sewn onto the fabric, and then I've pressed it and I open this out, so when I come to sew the sides of the jacket together, I can just keep going down in one smooth action. And here I am just putting in that second pocket. I don't want to again have only one pocket in a garment, and these were done with just under 1 centimetre of seam allowance, just so the pocket would sit slightly sort of in the recess and you wouldn't see the inside colour. And just through the seat of the chair there you saw a quick glimpse of Ivy as she snuffles out looking for things to bark at. Now, as I've said in previous videos, I am no tailor, and I've been pretty much self-taught with most of my sewing journey so far. So the easiest way I've found with doing up the sides of the jacket, I actually fit the hood of the sleeve into the open jacket. So I'll sew the shoulder seams together and leave both the sides open, attach the hood into the jacket before sewing the sleeves together, and then sewing the side seams all in one go. So where I've joined the piece of fabric together, there's a little bit of wobbling going on there in where they join at the hood of the sleeve. So I just do a little trim there and then start attaching the sleeve to the bodice. What I do is I start with either end of the sleeve, and then I find the centre of the top of the sleeve and line that up with the shoulder seam of the jacket, and then ease that fabric round by pinning it and distributing all that fabric equally as I go round. both my sleeves are in and it's time to start sewing them on. I do this nice and slowly. The last thing I want to do on the most noticeable bit of the jacket around the top is to get any puckers in the fabric, so I do take that sewing nice and slow to get it nice and even going round. Didn't do a separate waist seam, the jacket was pulling a little bit and making me look quite large. So the way I got round this was I actually got some 2-inch gross grain ribbon and used it as a waist tape. So I measured it quite a little bit bigger than my natural waist, so it ended up, rather than my 42-inch waist, it ended up being about a 44-inch. And then I distributed this gross grain ribbon all the way around the jacket, pinned it in place down the seams, and then I stitched in the ditch to attach the ribbon on the inside of the coat. So once I put the coat on afterwards, it pulled all that fabric in and helped define my waist. I think over time, had I not done that, this jacket is just, or this coat's just going to stretch and stretch until it's completely misshapen and has no waist whatsoever.
That is why I won't do 2 shows a night anymore, babe. I won't do.
And then is the fun bit, the embellishing. I did originally think I was going to embellish this directly onto the back of the jacket, but because I'm quite new to the old embroidery machine, I didn't know how the seams of the stripes would affect it. So I ended up using a scrap of the faux suede that I'd used for a recent project, my Snow Hill jacket, as a base for my embroidery. I do love watching the embroidery machine work. There's something very hypnotic about it, punching its little needles in and creating shapes that you start to recognise. And then while the embroidery machine was doing its thing, I started on the sandworms. Again, I used the embroidery machine when it came to doing their heads. I actually hand drew the head of the sandworm and then converted it into an embroidery pattern. And then using the similar technique to how I did my coat, I striped black, white up the body of the sandworm and then attached the head at the very end. And then these were pinned around the jacket and then appliqued on. By the time I got to this point in the coat, I was a little bit exhausted. It was Halloween week already. I usually take the week off from work for Halloween so I can get lots of sewing projects done, and the deadlines for me actually getting something finished before Halloween itself was slowly getting closer and closer. So when it came to sewing the sandworms together and attaching them to the coats, what should happen is you use an interfacing for all of those joining seams. Here with my embroidery machine, I had a few issues. It was playing up and not doing what it was meant to. It kept coming up that it had snapped, and I actually found that there was a tiniest little bit of rusting on one of the cogs inside. So I got a little bit of WD-40 on the end of a Q-tip, just rubbed it over that rusty area, and suddenly my machine was working like a dream again. So that's some of the risks you take in buying a second-hand machine. But it was the only way I was going to be able to afford an embroidery machine, not knowing whether I'd actually find a use for it or not. So back on with the sewing. So with the sandworms, what you should do is use a piece of interfacing for each of the seams where you join the pieces together, and then again use interfacing or like a tearaway stitch layer on the back of the fabric as you applique them together. As I say, by this point I was in a rush, I was getting lazy, and I didn't do that. So you might notice when the coat is finished, there is a slight bit of puckering around the applique of the sandworms. I know how I could do it better, but I was just so pleased to get the job finished by the time I got there. I did try to order some buttons off of old Fleabay of some skulls, but when they arrived they were actually quite tiny, and because of the size of the jacket I felt I needed something a bit bigger. And then really lucky, I went out for a day with my babies and we saw a haberdashery shop, and I said, oh, let's just pop in so mummy can see the fabric, and there were the perfect stripy buttons. Getting the collar onto this jacket was an absolute pig. Trying to do an interface for the fleece, it ends up in some points about 6 layers of fleece fabric, and it was an absolute pig of a job, which is why there is no video footage of me doing that. Collars are not my favourite thing. One day I will learn to do them properly. So here I am in the finished coat. Always like to have a dress up if I can, especially around spooky season, and my coat is done. It's got such a lot of fabric in there, it does give a lovely spin. When I've walked around my little village, I've got some lovely comments from the neighbours. Hope you've enjoyed today's video. If you have enjoyed, it'd be really good if you could give this video a like, and also subscribe to the channel so you can see more of the crazy antics that I'm going to get up to. It would also be really lovely if you could leave a couple of comments. It'd be nice to hear what you think of the items that I've been making so far. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I really hope that you will join me again for another one in the future. Thanks ever so much. Bye bye.